Thanks so much, Mark, for that introduction. Thank you also to AirPower for the invitation to speak. Bernard Salt, I'm the Managing Director of the Demographics Group. You may recall that I worked with KPMG Demographics for, in fact, almost 20 years, founded that group, retired from the partnership in June of last year, and effectively doing the same thing under my own consultancy. In fact, my presentation today, dealing with digital natives, dealing with Generation Y, or the millennial generation, as you might know it. In fact, looking at the future and looking at engaging that next generation. In fact, I want to start, however, by taking a really, really big picture question and asking a very simple question of the Australian people. In fact, is Australia a good place to be over the next 20 or 30 years? If I was a millennial, if I was 25, I would ask that question. Why should I invest my youth, my energy, my career, my life into this country over that period in time? And here is the reason why I think you should, in fact. Here is the world population, effectively over 200 years. That's 1900 on the left, and I'll show you through to the end of the 21st century on the right, and it shows you the number of people on the planet. Very simple. So 2 billion people at the turn of the 20th century. We have around about 7 billion people today. And then the best demographic brains on the planet, the UN Demography Department, say that by the end of the 21st century, in fact, there will be close to 12 billion people on Earth. Another 5 billion people, in fact. What can you say about the world in, say, 2070 or 2080, towards the end of today's millennials' lives, in fact? Because I think there are some things that you can say about the world in half a century's time. I think that we will see a mad scramble for food, energy, water, resources, commodities, space, security, lifestyle. What is it that Australia has to offer the rest of the world? Food, energy, resources, commodities, space, security, lifestyle. We have what the rest of the world will progressively want over the next generation, in fact. That makes Australia a valuable commodity. I think it makes Australia a vulnerable commodity, in fact. I think that military issues, defence issues, will become increasingly important in a crowded world. If you actually take that squiggly line, this is produced by the UN, and it shows world grain production, and the scale is off to the side from 1960 through to 2016, we produce 3 billion tonnes of grain, wheat, barley, rice, corn, to feed 7 billion people. It's not evenly distributed, of course, but well, that's the world population. This is world grain production. I wonder how much grain we need to produce up there. Well, that needs to be up there somewhere, I would have thought. That's all right, we'll just plant out all the unused arable land on the planet. Well, in fact, there is none. That makes Australia a valuable commodity. That creates opportunity for the Australian people. All we need to do is to ensure social cohesion, in fact, security, independence, prosperity. These big picture issues will deliver a prosperous, safe, secure and livable life for the next 2 or 3 generations of the Australian people. That's all we're asking, in fact. It's a big issue, I would have thought, a big challenge, but in actual fact, you would have to say that Australia is pretty well positioned in that regard. Let's take another big picture perspective and look at the biggest countries on Earth in our time in history. Of course, this is by GDP, gross domestic product. It's effectively the business worth, if you like, of the world's biggest countries. The United States, $19,000 billion in GDP every 12 months. This is in US dollars, in fact. The United States is the Roman Empire of our time. And there's China at around about 60% of the US, in fact. In the year 2000, China was at 30%. In 1990, it was 10%. At no point during the Cold War did Russia or the USSR ever get to any more than 10% of the American economy. China is already at 60%. This is in US dollars. Purchase price parity, of course, it's almost level pegging. And Australia, of course, We are the 13th biggest economic force on the planet. Interestingly, at the Olympics, we also come in at about number 13. We're about fair value, I think, in terms of the Olympics. In fact, we're a medium-sized country. In fact, when you think about it, that's not the real measure. The real measure is, in fact, in GDP per capita. Just take the economic output of the country, divide it by the population. It's not evenly distributed, of course. And then I remove any country with less than about 4 million people. You're looking at places of critical mass and the richest places on earth. Switzerland, it's only 7 million people, but very, very rich, very well-to-do. The United States, of course, 320 million people, the largest economic force in history, of course, and Australia's key ally. Denmark, of course, Australia. We're rich. We're the third or fourth richest people on earth, in fact. Where are the forces coming from? Where is the rising powers across the planet, in fact? And another way to do this is to actually look at the rising income per capita over the last 5 years in GDP per capita in US dollars. And in fact, here are the fastest growing economies, in fact. This is GDP per capita in US dollars from 2012 to 2017, and see Australia going backwards. In fact, a lot of this is explained by a shift in exchange rate. So the Australian dollar relative to the American dollar has dropped quite significantly over that time frame. But again, eliminating any small country, series of places of economic worth, if you like, or economic value or impact, shaping the world as we know it. And several of those, of course, in our direct region, in fact. Let's take a big picture look at our direct region. In fact, here is the continent of Australia. In fact, and a number of outposts, islands, of course, Cocos Keeling, Christmas Island, Coral Sea Island, Macquarie Island. We have two slices, claims to slices of the Antarctic continent. They're suspended, of course, those claims, but historically we have them. In fact, here is the state of Texas in the US by the same scale. More people live in Texas than on the Australian continent, in fact. And when you look at the extent of our land claim, it's the most extraordinary claim by the Australian people. Not even the Americans make such an outrageous claim in terms of an entire continent, in fact, and a third of the Antarctic continent, all the other little bits and pieces. The only way 25 million people, there's 27 million people in Texas, the only way 25 million people can make such a land claim, in fact, is if we have the imprimatur of the prevailing world superpower. The Brits in the 19th century, the Americans in the 20th century, who'll be the prevailing world superpower in the second part of the 21st century, in fact. These are big and uncomfortable questions for the Australians to ask, in fact. Big picture demographic trends, mega trends, if you like, that set the trajectory, that ask the questions that are really quite uncomfortable for Australians, in fact. Let's take this further, bring it back to Australia and compare Australia with a number of other world countries, particularly in terms of cities. Those numbers against the Australian cities are drawn from the 2016 census, and it shows the proportion of the population born outside the Australian continent. So the biggest city is Sydney. 39% of the Sydney population was born outside the Australian continent. That actually sounds like quite a lot. Find me another city on earth where more than 39% of the population was born outside that country. There's only two on the map. One is Dubai. These are guest workers. They do not have the same sovereign rights as migrants. And the other is Toronto, and they're all Americans just across the border, in fact. Sometimes these simple high-altitude figures speak to a profound cultural truth about a people and a nation, in fact. I do not believe that you can credibly make the case that the Australian people are fundamentally racist. Racist incidents, perhaps, not fundamentally racist, when 39% of the biggest city was born outside the Australian continent. Go to New York, the great melting pot, 29%. Go to Paris, 22%. Go to Berlin, 13%. Go to Tokyo, 2%. Go to Shanghai, 1%. The Germans get all angsty when Berlin gets to 13%. Sydney, Australia is at 39%. If we had a problem, then this would have been rioting on the streets at 20%, 25%, 30%, 35%. That must make the Australians the most plastic, pliable, absorbent, changeable, dynamic culture on earth. And if we're not, show me who does it better. In fact, a changeable people, an absorbent people, an influenceable people, a malleable people, you could argue, in fact, but a profoundly prosperous people who assume a right to prosperity and who assume a right to security. These are, I suggest, dangerous assumptions for the Australian people. The other observation I have here is that every wealth-generating region on the planet for 100 years has had a lifestyle area nearby. In the 1990s, wealth was generated out of the Middle East, so you make your money in Saudi Arabia or Kuwait, but you park your money, your family, your lifestyle, you buy an apartment, you live 3 months of the year in the safe haven of Dubai. That's why Dubai exists. It's a safe haven in a troubled world. Russian billionaires do not live in Moscow. If you have $1 billion to spend, are you really going to live in Moscow? You're going to live in London, in Belgravia, and you would set up transnational residencies, in fact. So you make your money in Moscow, but you live in London. What is the greatest wealth-generating region on the planet in our time in history? That'd be China. Make your money in Shanghai, Guangzhou, Beijing, Shenzhen. Park your money, your family, your lifestyle, buy an apartment, live 3 months of the year, educate your kid in a local university, go to hospital, have a facelift, go to a casino, play golf, go shopping, an overnight flight away from Shanghai, 8,000 kilometres. What are my options? No. Yes. Money will flow from there to there for as long as the regulatory environment permits it. In fact, China does not deliver lifestyle cities. Australia does, in fact. There are still Russian billionaires living in Belgravia 25 years after the collapse of the USSR because it is a fundamental cultural truth. London is a better lifestyle city than is Moscow. Sydney, Melbourne, Brisbane, Adelaide, Perth are better lifestyle cities than Shenzhen, Shanghai, Guangzhou, in fact. A fundamental truth, I think, about our bigger picture region, in fact. Here is another perspective. It shows what I think is the great diaspora, if you like. If we're going to see the great middle classification, we need a new verb to describe the middle classification process coming out of China and maybe out of the Philippines, maybe out of Vietnam, maybe out of India, if you're describing the totality of the 21st century, in fact. And you go to Vancouver, 41% actually have Asian Indian heritage, either born there or with one parent actually born there. And you can actually see, I reckon there's a fault line. This is Asian Indian down to perhaps San Francisco and then Los Angeles and south. It's more of a Latino effect. So those two plates, if you like, collide somewhere between Los Angeles and San Francisco. There's Sydney at 20%, Melbourne at 17%. In fact, you can see the direction that this is actually going. And the most plastic, pliable, changeable, absorbent culture, Australia, will be moved, changed as a consequence of these trends, in fact. Here is a bigger picture perspective of the Australian population. Here's Texas. Here's 25 million people on the Australian continent, broken down into the different generations, in fact, with the baby boomers, about 5 million people, between 53 and about 70, of course. Then you have the Generation X's sitting in the middle. And here is the millennials, the next generation, in fact, the generation that you are recruiting, the generation that will deliver the next round of management, if you like, of defence personnel, in fact. You can actually see the components of the demography. Here is that millennial population, in fact, aged 18 to 34 or 35, over 100 years. This is 1980 on the left, and it goes through to about 2060 on the right, and it shows you the net growth or contraction in the young population of Australia. And these are baby boomers in the late 60s and 80s, and of course, and then the baby boomers move into their late 30s and 40s, and there's not enough people coming along behind, so you get this diminution of youth. In fact, this echo effect. Here is the next 40 years. and you can actually see a stronger level of overseas immigration, particularly Asian, Indian and Arabic influences, reshaping Australia, reshaping a culture that is already plastic, pliable and absorbent, in fact. Over this time in history, we had a stronger Mediterranean influence. And you can see that reshaping our culture, out with tea, in with coffee, in with arugula, in with olive oil. Who knew what quinoa was 5 years ago? Who knew how to pronounce quinoa 5 years ago? It's an Arabic grain. If you go to America, the Americans are unimpressed by anything outside America. The Australians are impressed by everything outside Australia, in fact, because we are a colonial, isolated culture, much impressed by what is out there, and quite suggestible when you think about it. And here is the next 30 or 40 years or so. You would actually say there's quite a strong pipeline, if you like, in terms of the straight demographics. It's a matter of recruiting that demographic group going forward, in fact. Here is a big picture perspective of the Australian population. We have a census every 5 years. We ask 62 questions. Here's one of them. The Americans have a census every 10 years and they ask 12 questions. One of the questions we ask is, what is your religious affiliation? I'm not particularly interested in the religious numbers, but there is something so compelling about this. It's never the numbers. It's always the story behind the numbers. There is something happening in Middle Australia, and it's reflected in this chart. When we ask people, what is your religious affiliation, 7 million people said, I'm nothing. I'm an atheist, in fact. This is incredibly important because that figure is up 45% on the number just 5 years earlier. I would have expected that figure to be 10% at most. It's almost like a bomb has gone off across Middle Australia, exploded and shifted the Australian heartland's thinking. I wonder what could have happened between 2011 and 2016. The Royal Commission into Child Abuse, in fact, has shifted the way Australians think. In fact, the bigger picture narrative here is that Middle Australia is saying, I no longer trust big institutions like a church. I no longer trust big institutions like the major political parties, like big unions, and most certainly I do not trust big business, in fact. If you wish to connect with me locally, tribally, in a communal, authentic way, in fact. That is what I think is happening across the Australian continent, a shift, a loss of faith, a loss of trust in big institutions. Connecting with Middle Australia is far more complicated today than it has been at any time in the past. And it all comes down, that figure, it speaks to something else. Never look at the raw figure. There is a bigger picture story behind every one of those numbers, in fact. All of the Christian religions are going back, except for the Pentecostals. These are the Hillsong Church. Of course, on the Gold Coast, the Hillsong Church has increased by 25%. I don't know who the pastor is on the Gold Coast, but he or she is doing a fantastic job for the Pentecostals, in fact. Here is another perspective. I love this chart because it looks at the issue of economic confidence by the Australian people in the Australian economy over 60 years. This is 1961 on the left, and it is 2017 on the right. It is quarter by quarter GDP growth and contraction across the last 60 years. Your working life, maybe even your entire life, is stretched out across these bars. Let's just read this time in history together. From 1961, when Bob Menzies was the Prime Minister, we had growth, then recession, then growth, then recession, then growth, then recession, then growth, 25 years. If you had a choice to be a 25-year-old going into the workforce in any time of the last 200 years of Australian history, what year would you choose? Because I would choose to be 25 in that year, 1993. I'd have 12% unemployment behind me in the December, but I'd have 30 years of economic prosperity ahead of me. And I'd be 50 years old today and I'd look back and I'd say, I've been pretty damn successful in my career. Maybe you should have been pretty damn successful in your career. You have had a dream run, in fact. Go back to the 1960s. Start a business in the 1960s and you're selling product to people that can remember the Great Depression. that fought in the Second World War. Don't get too uppity, don't get too ahead of yourself, don't trust credit, don't get into debt. You know these people because they are your parents, in fact. Whereas today, you're recruiting, you're dealing with people at this time in history who have forgotten what a recession looks like. We think it's outrageous if unemployment has a 6 in front of it. No, it can actually have a 12 in front of it. And of course, you're dealing with a culture at this time in history that has a sense of entitlement, a sense of aspiration, in fact. We don't want to go on a caravan holiday to Coolangatta. We want a Jetstar holiday to Bali, in fact. We've lifted the bar, our outrageous expectation and entitlement. We presume security, we presume prosperity. The two dangerous assumptions of the Australian people, I would have thought, going forward. And you can see this writ large in how we live. Let's go back to this time in history to see how we lived and compare that with today. Here's how we live back in the 1950s. This is a quarter-acre block. It's a 3-bedroom brick veneer. It might be your home, might be your parents' home. Mum and dad, 4 kids. Dad works, mum's a housewife. 2 kids, bunk beds per bedroom. Let's visit Grandma and Grandpa back in the 1950s. Up the pathway onto the porch. It was called a porch. And then you turned right into the lounge room. The lounge room was a modern incarnation of the parlour. The parlour was the good room. There was only one good room back in the 1950s. The good room was where you entertained guests and suitors. Suitors never got near a bedroom back in the 1950s. Very different today, of course. And then off to the side would be a mahogany side stand with a silver tea service. The purpose of that was to showcase the wealth, the prosperity, the social status and the values of the couple that ran this household. Let's compare that with how we live today, how you live today, how Middle Australia lives today, after 25 years of unbroken and outrageous prosperity. Here's how we expect to live today. It's not 1,000 square metres, only 500 square metres. But it is 4 bedrooms, not 3 bedrooms. It's 2 bathrooms, not 1 bathroom. It's 2 income earners, not 1 income earner. And it's 2 kids, not 4 kids. Come with me into the house of today, into your house, down the pathway, through the entry. And in this configuration, you have a central hallway with bedrooms off to the side. Guests are entertained not in an English parlour at the front of the house, but in a Mediterranean kitchen family room in the belly of the house. It means that guests must now pass the open doors to the bedrooms, which means the bedrooms must now be glimpse perfect. And as a consequence, you've had the pillowfication of the bedroom over the last decade. Not 2 pillows, not 4 pillows, but 6 pillows. A thing that I now know is called a bolster, and a thing at the other end of the bed that's called a throw. The purpose of the pillowfication is to showcase the wealth, the prosperity, the social status, but importantly, the social harmony of the couple that run this household. Both partners work, but they've got enough time in the morning to fluff up the pillows exactly right. And men can never get the pillow architecture right. You grab the pillow by its ears, you fluff it up into position, and then you karate chop in the middle to give it this perfect V. This is as important to us today as was the silver tea service a generation ago, in fact. Then you take your guests down into the belly of the house and you mill around an island bench, which means the island bench must move upmarket. There's now marble, Calcutta marble in waterfall style. Rising out of the centre of it will be a silver Grosvenor gooseneck tap. Tapware is now the new silverware. It matters to the colonial Australians that it is Italian marble, German tapware, Danish closing mechanisms in the soft closing drawers, in fact. Out the back is what we used to call a back veranda, then we called it a deck. Today we call it al fresco, which is a Mediterranean term. And on the al fresco deck would be a barbecue with a wok burner. You can see the direction that this is moving in. I reckon the Greeks, the Italians that arrived here in the 1950s went, what the hell are you Australians doing living in an English house? You have a Mediterranean climate, even in Melbourne. You should have indoor, outdoor. Actually, you're right. It took us 30 years. Plastic, pliable, absorbent, tolerant, changeable, aspirational, outrageously entitled people. This is what you're dealing with. a presumption to security, a presumption to prosperity, in fact, going forward. You can actually see out the back is a little butler's kitchen. You have the show kitchen and then you have the real kitchen. When you do that, you need butler's kids, I reckon, for these sort of things. Here is my avocado column. I have a column in the Australian newspaper on a weekend in the magazine. And I wrote a column about 18 months ago where it was a parody on a baby boomer wandering into a hipster cafe. It was totally autobiographical. And I made the point as a baby boomer wandering into a hipster cafe, you can't read the menu because the writing is too small. You can't hear yourself speak because the music is too loud. You can't even sit on a milk crate because that means your bottom is lower than your knees and you can't get back up again. And then you secretly whisper to each other, because you could never say this out loud, look at all these young people eating smashed avocado, shouldn't they be saving for a house? It was all done as a parody on middle age, of course. Well, Twitter came along and took this comment about young people, saying, Bernard Salt said this about young people and smashed avocado, what do you think about that? And without the context of a parody, it didn't look good. That tweet went live at 6:27 a.m. on Monday morning. By 10 a.m, I was fielding calls from the BBC in London. This thing went global, viral and feral absolutely immediately. It made page 3 of the Stuttgart German newspaper, made the newspapers in Caracas, Venezuela. I particularly liked the social media around this. I stopped eating smashed avocado and now I own a castle, in fact. It was all the work of the millennial generation, of course. I thought the whole thing had died off about 6 months ago. Then the local 60 Minutes did this interview with a Melbourne developer and asked him about the smashed avocado. He said, no, you can't have smashed avocado and buy a property. And it was off again. The American 60 Minutes picked it up, ran it throughout America, and now the Americans will refer to the avocado toast generation. It all comes back to that one column, showing, of course, a sense of tension, if you like, between the generations, which I think is very real, right across both America and Australia. Here is where prosperity is created in the 21st century. Between November 2000 and November 2017, the Australian economy has added 3.9 million jobs. Full-time, part-time, good jobs, bad jobs. I'm interested in broad brush, high-altitude demographics. We lost, let's call it 300,000 jobs. Alcoa closes in Geelong, it's 1,000 jobs. Queensland Nickel closes in Townsville, that's 250 jobs. But does that mean for every job we have lost thus far in the 21st century, we've created 12 others, 12 to 1? It's a good relation. When I do this for America, it's 6 to 1, 12 to 1. Where else would you rather be? On the planet, thus far this century, in fact. We've created 3.6 million jobs in 17 years. Where are those jobs? Well, that'd be up here in healthcare, 800,000 out of 3.6 mil. Is that 20%, 25% or so? And the oldest baby boomer is what, 68, 69? Is this a space to be in? Absolutely. Healthcare, construction, professionals, education, never look at the numbers. The Australian people are talking to you through this chart and they're telling you where prosperity lies. In order to share in the prosperity of modern Australia, you need, to play in this space, you need either a university degree or technical training. These are knowledge workers, in fact. Where do you not need to be? Well, this would be down here, manufacturing. We have outsourced that functionality to Guangzhou, in fact. And then agriculture, we're producing more agricultural output than ever before. We just don't need the labour in the regions. This is unskilled work, this is skilled work, this is them, this is us. How did you bastards get to be so rich? The greatest threat, I think, to Australia, this issue of willpower, a galvanised nation, is the opposite of a divided nation. Almost a Blade Runner-ish world of the haves and the have-nots, of gated communities. That, I think Australia works better when everyone believes they have a chance at prosperity, in fact. National unity, a galvanised, focused people, working hard, paying tax, and all pointing in the right direction. That, to me, is the strongest way of securing our long-term future, in fact. What jobs have diminished most? thus far this century. The job of photographic developer and printer. It's instructive that I feel it necessary to explain to the millennial generation exactly what this job involved. Prior to digital cameras, you'd take your film into a chemist in Australia, they'd send it off. 2 weeks later, you get 24 colour photographs. There were 5,000 people employed in that job in the year 2001. It's down to less than 1,000 today, in fact. Complete digital disruption. Does that mean that there are 4,000 people sitting at home festering and fermenting revolution? Or have they been redeployed? And I say they've been redeployed. That, to me, is the great strength, the agility, the redeployment of disconnected, disaffected, unemployed, disrupted workers. That is the great opportunity for Australia, the great opportunity and threat, in fact. Word processing operator, there were 14,000 of them, in fact, in the year 2000. Over the last 15 years, everyone has learned how to type. No need for a word processing operator. Everyone has learned how to type, in fact. And sewing machinists, well, those jobs are now done in Guangzhou. What jobs have been created? The job of barista, of course. This is why I love demographics. We might be losing sheet metal workers by the thousands, but we desperately need 37,000 baristas on the Australian continent. The word barista was not acknowledged by the census as a job prior to 2006. The Boffins in Belconnen said, I think this job called barista, let's run it in the 2006 census. 8,000 Australians said, yes, I am a barista. It's now 37,000. What this shows is within 10 years, you can have a job that no one has even heard of. 10 years later, 40,000 Australians, yes, that is my job. What job in 2028 that we have not even heard of today will exist, in fact? Agility, adaptability. These are the great traits that will ensure Australia's future. Yes, we need the defence issues, all those sorts of things, but there are soft cultural shifts, a united nation, an adaptable nation. That's what I'm seeing in these figures. It's never the numbers. If you're just looking at the numbers, you're not seeing enough, in fact, from the census. Management consultant, truck driver. I think we're actually passing peak truck driver right now, with driverless vehicles we'll see steadily emerge over the next 2 censuses, over the next 10 years or so. And so do 137,000 truck drivers sit at home festering and fermenting revolution? Or can we as a nation, as a people, as a society, find a way to redeploy those people in a meaningful and gainful way to make a contribution to Australian society? That, to me, is legitimately part of holding us together and creating a strong nation into the future. There are 2 sides, the hard side and the soft side. This is the soft cultural side of creating a stronger nation, in fact. Here is the Defence Force in 2011, 73,000. I don't know whether that's exactly right or whether... So people were asked what your job was and what industry. 73,000 Australians said that they were in the Defence Force in some way. In fact, I know it's more than the number of people actually in the Defence Force, but here is their age profile. So about 14,000 in their early 20s. Here's 5 years later. So it's up around about 2% or so. That should be plus 3%, in fact. And here's a little gap there, and a little gap there. Engaging Generation Y, or the millennial generation. There's enough of them, you can actually see the pipeline, but actually getting them into the Defence Force is part of the great issue, in fact, going forward. And a slow ageing of the population here, at a big, broad brush sort of level. And just finally, some key points about the millennials. These are the 20-somethings, effectively. Around about 6 million now, 6.5 million by 2025. Never experienced a recession. Think unemployment with a 6 in front of it is outrageous. The most educated, the most widely travelled, the most digitally connected community in history. The most ethnically diverse generation of Australians, pretty much ever, you would say. And famously changeable, adaptable. The criticism of this generation by the baby boomers is that they can't settle to anything. But in actual fact, if you think about the skills that are required in the 21st century, it's about adaptability, flexibility, agility, fit-in ability, in fact. And many of those qualities I see very much marking the characteristics of that generation. To me, I think that the issues are as much around soft culture, a united nation of Australians, a prosperous Australia, an ambitious and aspirational Australia. All of those factors unite us and create a much stronger nation to support our Defence Force into the future. Thank you very much.